Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Crops TV. My name is Brian Doherty. I'm a field agricultural engineer with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. And our topic for today is making the most of your manure nutrients. So what I want to do is start out with just a discussion on some different equipment considerations and best management practices for manure application. We'll take a look at the impact of different weather and field conditions on applying manure, and then look at some research from the Northeast Research and Demonstration Farm near Nashua, Iowa, where we've got some data on nitrogen uptake with cereal rye cover crop, nitrification inhibitors, as well as manure application timing. But to start out here, I'm going to show some video discussion of equipment maintenance for making the most of your manure nutrients, some best management practices, and then a brief discussion on soil disturbance with different manure injectors, because that will have an impact on how we can manage cover crops in a manured system, and then a discussion of both wet and dry field conditions and the impact that has on manure application. As far as recommendations or best practices for manure application this year, the first thing I would mention is just having good equipment maintenance, making sure that everything's working properly on your manure application equipment. So you want to make sure that if you've got sweeps or coulters or whatever you have on your application equipment, you want to make sure those are nice and sharp. Again, if you've got dry soil conditions, you want to make sure you can slice through that hard soil, so that's important. And a few years back, the ag engineers did some research looking at manure application equipment, and they found that there was a lot of variation in application rate across the toolbar. And there's different things that can cause that. One of the issues they found were the air vents were getting plugged on some of the tankers. So if you can see up at the top of the unit here, there's some little circular vents up there, and so they allow the pump to work properly. But what can happen, as you're turning your pump on and off, a little bit of manure can get up into those vents. As long as you keep applying, that's not a problem. But when you go to put that equipment away for the season, if those vents aren't cleaned out, that manure can sit in there and actually plug that air vent. And so if that happens, that tends to cause a lot of uneven manure application across the toolbar. So, for example, if you're targeting a 200-pound nitrogen application rate, you might have 300 pounds coming out out of one tube and maybe 100 pounds in a different one. So there can be a lot of variation there. So what we recommend is definitely check over your equipment before you start applying. It's a good idea to just put several hundred gallons of water in the tank, just turn your pump on and come around behind and just look across your application toolbar and see if it looks like there's relatively even distribution or roughly the same amount coming out of each tube. The other thing that can happen is these tubes, you want to make sure those aren't crimped. If you can get rid of the loops in those hoses, that can also help. So keep them as short as possible and try to eliminate those hose loops. So check your loops, make sure they're not kinked, check your air vents, and then just do a kind of a pre-season check and make sure that that toolbar is applying the way it should be. The next recommendation that I would have, once you've got your equipment maintenance up to snuff, is just looking at the timing. So we want to delay those manure applications until that soil has cooled below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So the 50-degree range research has found that's when the microbial activity in the soil really starts to slow down. So if you're above 50 degrees, the microbial activity, those microbes are still fairly active, and it's those microbes that drive the nitrogen cycle in the soil. So they're the microbes are converting that ammonium to nitrate, and nitrate is very soluble, and it easily moves basically wherever the water goes in the soil, that's where your nitrate's going to go. So we want to wait until those soils have cooled down below 50 degrees, if at all possible, before we apply you know, whether it's manure or any other nitrogen source, just to help prevent, you know, we don't want that cycling happening. So if we wait till later in the fall, hopefully that nitrogen will still be there in the spring. Another management practice that you can do along with that is consider the use of a nitrification inhibitor. So what that does is it just prevents those microbes from converting that nitrogen from ammonium to nitrate. And so that can help potentially reduce some of those nitrogen losses. The yield data on the inhibitors is kind of mixed. We've got some research from Nashua showing that we are seeing a yield advantage with the Instinct nitrification inhibitor. If it was put in with fall manure, we had one year where it went on with spring manure and we saw no advantage in that case. On the water quality side, we haven't really seen any benefits with the nitrification inhibitors, but there's some research that shows that you can get a pretty good yield response with that. Other research is more mixed. You know, the yields aren't statistically different, and you know, sometimes it doesn't cover the cost of the inhibitor. So I can't give a blanket recommendation that everybody should use that, but it's another tool that you can look at to help keep some of that nitrogen in the fall. And then the final recommendation I would have is to plant a cover crop if at all possible. Having that cover crop there can help with some of these issues where you've got extra nitrogen in the fall. You can, if you plant, you know, grass cover crops or brassicas, they're very good at taking that nitrogen up out of the soil profile and holding it in the biomass. And then the following spring, that biomass will degrade when you terminate it. And at least some portion of that should become available for the crop the following year. So if you have dry manure that you're applying, that's a little bit different situation than liquid manure. The nitrogen in dry manure tends to be more in the organic form, so it's less likely to be lost. So I would say if you have both, if you have dry manure and liquid manure to apply, you would want to apply your dry manure first and then wait on the liquid manure until, you know, the soils have cooled down below 50 degrees if at all possible. So there are several different styles of manure injectors and application equipment, and they will all have, you know, slightly different effects on the soil. So this particular injector here is a fairly low disturbance unit. So it's got a coulter that runs in front of the injector. Your manure comes out here, and then this will actually be below the soil. And then there's a blade behind that will basically close that trench back up again. So when you're applying this manure with an injector, the main goal is just to get it below the surface and get that closed back up. You don't want to see any liquid on the surface. Several advantages there. You know, a big one is odor control. So if you can keep that covered up, it really helps reduce odor. And then the other is it really helps to reduce nutrient loss, particularly from surface runoff, if you can get that manure injected. Okay, so here's another style of manure application equipment. Now from a distance, this might look like a manure injector, but this is actually what's considered surface application followed by incorporation. So the manure is just coming out the hose here. It's actually getting applied on the soil surface, and then the blades throw some soil up and cover that manure. And so that keeps it fairly close to the surface. But with this type of equipment, you do have quite a bit of soil disturbance because you have to be able to pull up enough soil to get that manure covered. So this would not be what we would consider, you know, minimum or low disturbance equipment. The other option for applying manure is if you're going to surface apply, you can actually have the manure come out what we call a splash plate up at the top here, and that basically just spreads it on the surface, and then you come back with some tillage equipment and incorporate that manure. So here's another style of manure injector. This is what we call a sweep injector. So you can see here it's got this one has a pretty large sweep on it. So this is very similar to what you would find on a cultivator or, you know, a chisel plow, that sort of thing. So the manure is going below the surface. The sweep opens up a slot underneath the soil to hold that manure, and then generally you'll get quite a bit of disturbance with this type of unit. So this is an older style. It has a very large sweep on it and it's angled, so it's basically going to look like that field has been chisel plowed when you get done. There's a variation on this style that's called a knife injector, where it's similar to this, but it just doesn't have the wide sweep on the bottom. That'll make more of a up and down slot in the soil for the manure. And the newer style injectors that have the sweeps are much lower disturbance. They tend to have a shovel here that's very flat, so it just slices through the soil. It doesn't lift it, and so it'll inject the manure into that slot. And so a lot of the application equipment now is going to more of that style where they're much lower disturbance. You know, we have a lot of people that are trying to transition to no-till or do minimum tillage. And so that's kind of the trend we're seeing in the industry, is the move towards more low disturbance injection equipment. There are resources available to help producers. There's several commercial labs here in the state and around the Midwest that will do manure analysis. So I'd recommend taking a sample and submitting that to a lab. If you're looking for labs to submit to, you can go to the Iowa Manure Management Action Group website. If you just do a web search for, again, Iowa Manure Management Action Group, you can find a list of labs that are certified for doing manure analysis. And also, if you're looking for assistance with manure management plans, there's a list of service providers on that website as well that can help you with manure management plans. And if you're having trouble finding somebody, all of the extension field ag engineers can also assist with manure management plans. So when it comes to applying manure, there are definitely some advantages to having dry field conditions. The first one being that you don't have to worry about the mud as much. There's less compaction generally when you're applying in dry conditions. And the second is that, you know, with dry soil, it actually has more capacity to hold liquid manure. So it's a little bit easier to get that manure infiltrated and get it held in the soil when you have dry soil conditions. There's just more capacity in the soil because those pores aren't filled up with water. And then the third one this year, with our dry conditions in some parts of the state, a lot of that crop might come out earlier than normal. And so that gives us more time this fall potentially to get field work done. So that can be, you know, especially after the last few years of challenging field conditions in the fall, that might be a welcome break for producers to have that extra time to get some field work done. But, you know, there are some concerns as well with dry conditions. You know, one being when the soil's dry, it tends to be a little bit harder. And so there might be some challenges in getting the injectors into the soil, getting that manure injected with the hard soil. The second one is soil cracking. So if you're in a very dry area and you're seeing those cracks show up in your soil, there is potential for what we would call macropore flow in that case. So if you're injecting through that or you're applying manure, it can actually run down those cracks and end up deeper in the soil profile than we would like. Ideally, we want that manure up closer to the surface. We want it covered, but we want it close to the surface, so next spring when the crop starts growing, those nutrients are up fairly close to the root zone. So when you have cracks in the soil, that manure can end up deeper in the profile. Here in Iowa, it's typically hasn't been a big concern. Our cracks generally go about 20 inches or so deep. You usually don't see them much deeper than that. In other parts of the Midwest here, you get around the Great Lakes area, there are more concerns. They have more shrink swell clay soils, so they will expand and contract as moisture changes, and they can get some very deep cracks. And there's potential for those to go almost all the way down to the tile line. So it's something to keep in mind. We want to be aware of that, you know, if you do have a lot of cracking, there's potential for that macropore flow. But if you're concerned about it, you could take a rod and just kind of probe those cracks and see how deep they go. But it's something to be aware of here. And then the last one I would mention is, you know, we do have potentially better conditions for getting in the field this fall, but that might also lead to a situation where you want to get out there and get everything done while the weather's nice, But if you're applying that manure before the soil has cooled below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, there's definitely some concerns there with potentially losing some of those nutrients. And that kind of ties in with the dry weather. Another issue that we could have is more nitrogen left in the soil profile. If you've taken less yield off the field, you've had dry conditions, that tends to slow down microbial activity in the soil. And so we can end up with a situation where there's more nitrate or available nitrogen left in the soil profile after fall harvest than what we would normally have. And then if you're applying additional manure on top of that, there's potential to lose a lot of those nutrients before the spring crop goes in. And we did see that in 2012, where we had a very dry year that year. And so there was not very much water flowing through the tile lines. Yields were down. We had a fair amount of nitrogen left in the soil profile in the fall. And then in the spring of 2013, we had a lot of precipitation, and a lot of that nitrogen got flushed out of the system before it was taken up with the crop. So there's advantages to dry conditions. There's also some things that we need to be aware of. So right now we are seeing a fair amount of precipitation over a lot of the state. So we may actually end up with some areas that are wetter than we would like with fall manure application. So in that case, you're definitely going to be concerned about compaction. You want to just try and wait for a good stretch of weather. Again, wait until those soils have cooled down before you go out and try to apply that manure. If that soil is kind of right at field capacity where it's holding as much water as it can, that's where we tend to see the most compaction. So those are the kind of conditions that we want to avoid if possible. And again, when that soil is filled up with water and all of that pore space is filled, that doesn't leave a lot of room if you're injecting liquid manure. You know, that manure has to have somewhere to go. It has to have some pore space to hold that manure. And so if it's very wet, that can definitely create some challenges.
Here we have a quick field demonstration of different application methods to show both the pros and the cons of surface application versus injection. First up, we have surface application. This was filmed in Alameda County after corn silage harvest, and they'd had over 5 inches of rain the week prior to application here. So with corn silage ground, you have a fair amount of compaction to begin with, and on top of that, the very wet soils here, surface application may actually work better in these conditions. It can be quite difficult to inject, as you'll see in a minute. This field will be tilled as soon as it's dry and planted to a cereal rye cover crop to help prevent erosion and hold on to nutrients. And that's in general just a good way to manage this corn silage ground. It is quite susceptible to erosion. You can see what that looks like after the manure has been applied. There's still a fair amount of liquid on the surface, but that will dry relatively quickly, and it's important to get that incorporated as soon as possible to prevent nitrogen volatilization loss. And you can see a photo here what that looked like 3 hours later, so it does dry relatively quickly. Next, we'll take a look at injection. This particular machine has a very narrow sweep injector on it. This would be similar to a knife injector, and somewhere in between a wide sweep, which would cause a lot of soil disturbance, and a Coulter injector with minimal disturbance. This injection attempt here illustrates the importance of both preseason maintenance and field conditions when applying. These injectors hadn't been used in over a year. They just switched over so we could get some video. You'll see some issues as the machine goes by. The injectors are not getting manure into the ground. There's not enough down pressure. There's some plugging issues. And you can see a leaky gasket there in the top, so there's still some bypass flow. I slowed the video down here so you can see that unit bouncing. Again, not enough down pressure on that. This is very hard, wet, compacted soil, so it's difficult to inject in these conditions. So soil conditions do play a big role with manure management. In this case, that soil is very wet, so it's going to have a difficult time holding on to all of that liquid, even if you could get it injected into the soil properly. So in this particular demonstration, the surface application actually works better. Here's just a few more photos showing some different application attempts. On the right, you can see an injection where, again, the soils were wet. They were unable to hold all of the liquid. On the left side, that's what we want it to look like after injection. You don't see any liquid pooling on the surface. All of that manure has been injected below surface.
Okay, now that I've gone over a general discussion of equipment maintenance and some best management practices for managing manure application in the field, I want to get into a little more detail on how you can make the most of your manure nutrients. So the first strategy is to try and reduce the pathways for nutrient loss. So what are those pathways? The first is denitrification. So that's the conversion of nitrate, NO3, to nitrogen gas. Now, this one's a tough one to manage. That typically happens in the soil under anaerobic conditions, meaning that the soil's fully saturated. And so really the only way to manage that is try to improve your drainage or improve water flow through the soil. So that one's a little tough to manage. But the next three here, you can definitely have an impact on with management. So volatilization is the conversion of ammonium to ammonia gas, and that's typically going to happen at the surface. Leaching, that could be nitrogen or phosphorus in this case, to either a drain tile or groundwater. And then the fourth pathway is surface runoff. And now that could be any nutrient that's attached to a soil particle or part of the soil structure itself. It could be lost with erosion that's in that runoff. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you can reduce each of these as we go along. The second thing to consider is try to apply that manure at a consistent rate at the right time. So I talked about that a bit in the video, but it's really important to calibrate and keep that equipment maintained so that you're applying those nutrients consistently and evenly in the field to make the most of those nutrients. And then I'm going to probably keep harping on this, but it's really important to try to avoid that early fall manure application if possible. Or if you do need to apply early fall, I'd encourage you to put in a cover crop with that early fall application. And I'm going to show some data later on that kind of backs that up. The third thing that I would mention is it's important to try to recoup your investment. So the way I think about manure, the minute the feed truck pulls into your driveway, you essentially already paid for that manure. You bought it. It's no different than prepaying your fertilizer at the co-op. You've got the money already invested in that manure, so you want to get the most out of those nutrients. So start with not over applying nitrogen. I'd encourage everyone to use the nitrogen rate calculator. If you're not familiar with that, you can just do a web search for ISU N-rate calculator, and you should be able to find that. So one thing to keep in mind with that is those nitrogen rates are based on spring nitrogen application, not fall, so you might need to correct a little bit, but it's a good starting point for determining how much nitrogen you should apply. The second strategy here is to apply to soils that have a low phosphorus test. In that case, you can justify hauling further. So if you've followed work by Dr. Antonio Malorino, he showed that basically anything over 30 parts per million or so soil test on a Bray 1 or a Malic 3, you really don't get any additional yield increase when you apply phosphorus at that point. So if you can target fields that are lower than that in phosphorus, you might get a yield bump, and then you can justify hauling that manure further. So taking a little bit closer look at nitrogen and how we can manage that. So I'm showing the pathways of loss here, but what we want to happen with nitrogen is for that nitrogen to stay bound up in the soil organic matter or in the pool of nitrogen in the soil, or we want it to be taken up by the crop. And we want to shrink all of those other pathways where we can lose nutrients. So how do we do that? If you inject or incorporate immediately, that can help reduce volatilization. Focus on application timing. The closer you can apply that manure to when the crop actually needs those nutrients, the better off you're going to be. And then again, cover crops can really help plug some of these leaks, particularly the leaching aspect. And again, I'll show some data on that later. The runoff and erosion is not as big of a concern with nitrogen. There can be a small amount of nitrogen attached to soil particles, but that's generally more of a concern with phosphorus.
So let's take a look at phosphorus. Same thing here. We want to keep it in the soil, or we want it to be taken up by the crop. We don't want it to be lost. We don't have to worry about volatilization here. Phosphorus is pretty stable once it's in the soil. But again, we want to reduce leaching. We want to reduce that runoff and erosion in particular is where our concern is with phosphorus. Snowmelt in particular can be fairly high in phosphorus, that snowmelt runoff. So again, inject or incorporate that manure as soon as possible. Try to get it in the soil so we don't have to worry about that surface runoff. Prioritize and target those fields that are testing lower in phosphorus. And then anything you can do to reduce erosion, again, it's going to help in this case. And this is where I think low disturbance manure injectors can play a role. You know, the less disturbance you have of that soil surface, the less erosion you're going to have in the long run. So now I want to get into a little bit more detail on cover crops and how they can help in a system that's being managed with manure. So I like to think of manure and cover crops as kind of an integrated system. They really work well together. Those cover crops can capture and recycle nutrients from the manure and help reduce nitrogen loss in particular. And then the manure, again, gives your cover crop kind of a shot in the arm, gets it growing in the fall if you are applying in the fall. And then manure and cover crops can both provide a lot of benefits to your soil. So you see in the blue box there, several things listed. There's a fair amount of research to back this up for both manure and cover crops. And in addition with cover crops, there's other potential benefits like weed control, possibilities of grazing, and so forth. And with your manure, you're getting all of the micronutrients in addition to, you know, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So there's some added value there as well. So they really work well together as a system. The other thing that cover crops can do for you in a manure system is they have the potential to open up some additional manure application windows. So one of these could be early spring if you can get a cover crop established in the fall and then go in and apply manure in the spring. So cover crops generally are going to improve your trafficability in the field, and you may be able to get into the field sooner than you would be able to otherwise. So there's potential to get some manure on early spring into a cover crop that was established in the fall. The other window would be late summer. You know, if you have any small grains in your rotation, or maybe you're growing a cover crop for seed, you're going to use that seed yourself or sell it. You know, you're taking that crop off late summer. There's another window you could get some manure on. But again, if you do that late summer application, I'd highly encourage you to directly follow that up again with another growing crop to take up those nutrients. So how do we make this work? You know, there's several different options for getting cover crops established with manure. You can seed, you know, after fall harvest. That's kind of the standard right now. Drill that in after or before the manure is applied. You can seed that cover crop early, you know, into a early interseed, a V3 or V5 range, you know, early interseed, and then put manure on in the fall. Slurry seeding is an option. You know, if you do mix that seed in a manure tanker, I would just caution that you probably need to have good agitation, you know, keep that seed mixed up. Otherwise, it tends to either want to sink to the bottom or float to the top of the tank. And there are strategies now where you could potentially inject that seed directly into a drag hose line as well. Solid manure is also a good option with cover crops. You can get a cover crop established early and then spread solid manure on top of it later. I do get questions sometimes from people who are no-till and wondering if they can just leave that solid manure on the surface. In that case, with solid manure, generally your nitrogen form is more in the organic form, so you're less concerned about volatilization. So it's probably okay in that case if you don't want to till that soil. You could potentially leave some of those bedded pack manures or poultry litter on the surface. And another possibility, you know, you can see a photo on the left there where a producer is using that tanker to inject manure into, you know, corn early in the season, and then establishing a cover crop in the same pass. So again, there's lots of different ways to do this and potentially cut down on some passes through the field. and get those cover crops established with manure application. Injecting manure into a growing cover crop is another strategy. So potentially get the cover crop in early fall and then wait to apply your manure. You probably will need a fairly low disturbance injector to make this work. It's, you know, your cover crop survival is really going to depend on how much soil disturbance you have in that case. You can see a picture on the right there where, you know, that was taken in the spring after the manure was injected into the cover crop the previous fall. Now, if your goal is weed control, that's maybe not the greatest. You know, you don't have a very even cover crop stand there. But if you just want something to take up some nutrients, you know, there's a lot of biomass there. And so it'll be pretty effective in that case. So how do we make manure and cover crops work together? I've gone over, you know, most of these already, so I won't dwell on them. I haven't talked much about testing your manure, so that's important as well. You need to know what you have so you know how much to put on, you know, as well as testing your soils to know where those low phosphorus areas are. You know, just be consistent, follow the 4 R's. You know, following the soil health principles can also help, you know, in particular, reducing disturbance and just keeping the surface of that soil armored so you can prevent erosion. If you're new to cover crops, I'd encourage you to just start with what we call the easy acres, or anywhere you can get that cover crop in early. Corn silage ground is a good option in that case if you have corn silage ground. Start simple, start small. Don't do your whole farm with a 15-way mix right off the bat if you're not comfortable managing those cover crops. And just, you know, try to get it established as early as possible. That's where we tend to see the best growth and the best benefits from having that cover crop. And then carbon to nitrogen ratios are important as well in both the manure and the cover crop. So with liquid manures or slurry manures, they tend to have a fairly low carbon to nitrogen ratio, so there's a lot of nitrogen. It's going to be available pretty quickly. With bedded pack manures, on the other hand, if you've got a lot of straw or corn stover mixed in with that, that's going to have a pretty high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So that nitrogen, again, is going to be more in the organic form. It's going to be less available, and it's going to take longer to break down. Same thing with your cover crop. You know, the more green and lush that is, the earlier you terminate it, the more quickly it's going to break down and potentially release some of that nitrogen. Whereas if you let it go late, maybe you're going to plant green, let it get pretty tall, you know, that's going to have a pretty high carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's going to break down much more slowly. So those are just things to keep in mind when you're managing this system. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and show you some of the research that I've been referring to that was done at the Northeast Research and Demonstration Farm. So that's just outside of Nashua, Iowa. So I just want to give you a quick overview of what those plots look like. So there's 36 one-acre plots at this location, and they're all outfitted with a subsurface drainage water quality monitoring system. So basically we know how much flow is coming out of each plot, and then that's sampled weekly, and so we know the nitrate concentration and the dissolved phosphorus concentration in that drainage water. So these next several slides I'm going to show you here, this is where that data is coming from. So the cover crop management there, that's drilled after harvest, after manure application. So we're dealing with liquid swine manure in this case. That's applied at 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The cover crop is cereal rye seeded at 80 pounds per acre, and that's terminated in the spring with glyphosate, generally 10 days to 2 weeks prior to corn planting and give or take a couple days prior to soybeans. So pretty typical management on that cereal rye cover crop. So I'm going to start out talking about some water quality data. So just to let you know about the notation here, the SU150, that is a spring UAN side dress. So that goes on about 4 weeks after planting. EFM is our early fall manure. LFM is late fall manure. Again, all at 150 pound nitrogen rate. The NT stands for no-till, and the plus R, the red line, that is our cereal rye cover crop. And so I don't have time to go through all of these, but I'm just going to compare the cover crop, no cover crop comparison here. So with the cover crop, what we're looking at here is the cumulative loss in nitrogen in pounds per acre over a 5-year period. So with no cover crop in an early fall manure system, lost almost 220 pounds of nitrogen where it was about 145 with the cover crop. So it's reducing that total loss of nitrogen out the drainage line by about 33%. And this is in the corn phase, where we had early fall manure. So here's the same graph in the soybean phase. So there's no manure applied prior to soybeans. So losses overall tend to be lower. But here again, we see about a 30% reduction in total nitrogen loss in soybeans with that cereal rye cover crop. So the cover crop in general is very effective at preventing that nitrogen loss out the drainage line and improving water quality. So one of the things that showed up during this study in 3 out of the 5 years was a lot of streaking in the fields, and you can see that in the photo here. So there's significantly more cover crop growth directly over where that manure was injected. And so that's what you're seeing in this graph here, those first 3 years. So this is showing the amount of nitrogen in the above ground biomass in pounds per acre. So the red bar is the nitrogen uptake in that cover crop directly over the manure injection band. The green bar is between the manure injection band. And then the blue bar, those are the soybean plots where there was no manure applied. So I don't have the 2020 data here yet, but I do have the first 4 years. And so you can see substantial nitrogen uptake with that cover crop. Now 2019, you'll notice, looks different. So if you remember the fall of 2018, it was a real challenge. It was wet, it was cold, it got late. So that manure got put on really late. The cover crop got put in late. There was no growth in the fall. So we still saw about 60 pounds, 65 pounds of nitrogen uptake in 2019, but didn't see the streaking, didn't see the difference between the manure and no manure treatments, but we did see that in the other 3 years. So if we look at the averages over that 4-year study, so the top chart there, prior to corn, where manure was applied, about 88 pounds of nitrogen uptake with that cover crop, about 61 pounds prior to soybeans. And the interesting thing is, if you compare that to our old study, where these are the same plots, also cereal rye cover crop, but instead of early fall manure, it was a spring UAN side dress. And so much lower nitrogen uptake in the cover crop in that case. So that was an 8-year study. So we saw between 13 and 21 pounds in that case. So if you think about the nitrogen dynamics in that system, with the spring UAN, that cover crop's basically just taking up a little bit of residual nitrate that's left over in the profile in the fall. Whereas with early fall manure, you put the cover crop in right behind that, that manure is there, those nutrients are right there and ready to be taken up. And so that's why we see this, much higher nitrogen uptake in this early fall manure system. So it's a really good place to use a cover crop. Another thing we don't often think about is the economics of that. So what I showed here is just the 5-year average, and I compared, how much nitrogen did we prevent from going out the drainage line with that cover crop. So it was about 7 pounds per acre per year in soybeans, 14 in corn. And so if you had to buy that nitrogen, now granted, you wouldn't necessarily do that in any given year, but over the long run, if you're losing that nitrogen out your drainage line or into deeper groundwater every year, eventually you're going to have to replace that nitrogen in one way or another. You're probably going to end up buying it back at some point. So I would argue that we should be crediting our cover crops, in this case, somewhere between $3 and $6 an acre, the value of preventing that nitrogen from being lost from the system. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the effect on yields. So that's a big question of the cover crops. What are they going to do with yields? So what I'm going to start out with is our just cover crop, no cover crop comparison with early fall manure. So if you see 2016 there, we took a big yield hit with the cover crop. Now, I'd take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. That was a transition year from our old spring UAN system, and so I think it just kind of ran short of nitrogen that first year. But if you notice the next 3 years, the cover crop treatment actually out yielded the no cover crop treatment. And that makes sense to me when you think about the amount of nitrogen that cover crop's taking up, and think about where is that nitrogen going. If you don't have the cover crop, you probably lost a substantial amount of it. So it kind of makes sense that we would see, better yields with the cover crop in an early fall manure system. And now 2020 again looks different here. We did not see the yield advantage. I haven't done the statistics, but there's probably no statistical difference there. But 2020 was a very dry year at Nashua, unlike the previous years shown here. And so I think that dry weather is probably what played, a majority of the role in why we didn't see that difference, didn't see the advantage with the rye cover crop in 2020. So now I'm showing the same plots here, but instead of, cover crop, no cover crop comparison, now we're looking at a timing study. So we've got our early fall, so this would be the blue bars compared to the green bars here. So early to late fall comparison. And if you look across there, we've got 4 years of data with early to late fall. And 2019, again, was a different year. That was basically a late fall manure application. Soils were about 42 degrees when that manure was applied. And so when I talk about early and late fall here, so early fall manure, basically that goes on as soon as possible after harvest, typically around mid-October, whereas our late fall manure, that we wait until the soil is cooled below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's the distinction between early and late fall. Late fall, typically somewhere around mid-November, but it varies from year to year. But if you notice 2019 there, again, the manure went on late. None of what should have been our late fall manure treatments happened. That manure all got put on in the spring. So in that case, it's a late fall to spring comparison. But if we look at our 4 years with the early to late fall, it's about a 38 bushel per acre advantage just by delaying that manure application to late fall from early. The other interesting thing, if you notice here, the spring UAN treatment in most years pretty significantly out yields all of our manure treatments, except for 2019. So when that manure went on in the spring in 2019, there was no yield difference between spring manure and spring UAN. So I don't think we're seeing a source effect here. It's not that the UAN is a superior nitrogen source compared to swine manure. It's just the difference in timing, I think, is mostly why we see those yield differences. So we also have a timing study in continuous corn. And so in this case, we're comparing late fall manure. So the kind of the orangish bar there is late fall manure. The plus G, that's a gypsum treatment. I'm not going to talk about that today. That was part of a water quality study. The plus I, that's our instinct nitrification inhibitor that goes in with the manure. And then the SM, that is the spring manure application. So these are all at 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So if we compare late fall to spring, over that 4 years that's shown here, it's about a 28 bushel per acre advantage with spring manure compared to late fall. So it's the first 3 years there, we saw a big yield advantage. Again, 2020 did not see that advantage. So again, 2020 was a drier year. So I suspect that's why we didn't see that advantage with the spring manure in that case. And again, 2019, all of that manure went on in the spring. So we did not see any yield differences in the plots. So that's good. It actually tells us those plots are very consistent. And this timing effect we're seeing is real. So just to think about the economics of that a little bit, I plotted our Nashua data here, and I also looked up a couple other studies that looked at manure timing and showed the yield advantages here with those. So what I did is just compiled all those and looked at the average of 13 site years of data with early compared to late fall manure. It was about a 20 bushel per acre advantage in that case. So at $3.50 a bushel, you're talking $70 an acre there. There's 5 site years of data with the late fall to spring comparison, so less data there, but 26 bushel per acre advantage. So, just think about the potential economic advantage there. You're probably not going to see that every year. Again, we didn't see it in 2020, but, over the long run, that's, it's really hard to find many things that you can make $50 to $100 an acre, economic advantage. So it's potentially a good strategy and something to think about. The other thing we looked at with this study is the nitrification inhibitor. So I mentioned the instinct that's applied with the fall manure. So 2016 was a transition year. We threw that data out, but 2017, 18, and 2020, we did have instinct that went in with that fall manure. And so those 3 years, we're averaging about a 12 bushel advantage with that instinct. Now you notice 2019, again, is different. That manure went on in the spring, so they still put the instinct in with it in the spring, but when they did that, did not see any yield advantage when that instinct was applied in the spring. So we are seeing yield advantage with it in the fall. When it comes to water quality, we're not seeing any advantage with the instinct. So I also wanted to just quickly look at the economics of using instinct. I do get questions on that quite a bit. And so I compiled, the same studies here looking at instinct at different rates and different timings. So at Nashua, we've got late fall at the 70 ounce per acre instinct rate. So we're seeing the yield advantage there. Wazeeka, Minnesota, they looked at both early and late fall manure at different rates. So with the early fall manure, they did see a yield advantage with the instinct. But when they did their late fall manure, they did not see a yield advantage. So anything with an asterisk there is not statistically significant. And then Boone, Iowa, there was also a study, again, with early and late fall manure with instinct. Again, statistically, they didn't see any yield advantages there. So if you just think about the economics of that, it's kind of hit and miss. Some years it pays off, but you got to factor in the cost of the instinct itself. And, whether you're getting enough bushels, to make that, to justify that investment in that instinct. From this data, it looks like maybe half the time it pays off and half the time it doesn't. So just to wrap up here on thinking about how do we make the most of our manure nutrients, it's important to just manage that manure like it's a fertilizer that you paid for any other fertilizer, because, you've got the money invested in that manure already. So it's in your best interest to get the most out of it that you possibly can. And then cover crops, they definitely take management. So you want to manage those just like you would any other cash crop if you want to get the economic benefit of having that cover crop. Calibrating equipment, maintaining equipment, again, very important. You saw in the video how uneven that distribution can be if you've got issues with your tanker. So we need to have that manure applied evenly and consistently across the field to maximize the nutrient value. And then just think about what you can do to reduce those pathways of nutrient loss. So the main ones I would mention are wait to apply manure in the fall. Obviously here in Iowa, most of our manure does go on in the fall, but the longer you can wait, the less likely you're going to lose that nitrogen in particular before spring. So ideally, you want to wait until those soils have cooled below 50 degrees. Planting a cover crop is a good strategy for capturing that nitrogen in particular and keeping that from leaching out of the soil profile. Also a great strategy for reducing erosion. Low disturbance manure injectors, that's something, if you don't have them, maybe the next time you trade your equipment, that's something to think about. They do tend to be a little bit more expensive, but it might be worth the investment. It's another way that can potentially give you some more opportunities for getting a cover crop in earlier if you can inject manure into that afterwards. And just in general, reducing soil disturbance is going to help reduce erosion. And then I showed the data on manure timing. The longer you can delay that, regardless of what it does to your nutrient cycling, we are seeing a pretty good yield advantage with delaying those manure applications in most years, and applying that manure as close as possible to when the crops need it. So with that, I just want to say a quick thank you to Iowa Learning Farms, who helped put together the video segments, and Stutzman Incorporated for letting us use their facility to shoot that video and look at some of their equipment there. And then, thanks to Ken Pekanowski and all of the staff at the Northeast Research and Demonstration Farm and all the folks on campus who helped make that research project a reality. With that, I will wrap it up and we can take some questions.